Welcome to Between Two Chairs, Demystifying Commercial Real Estate, the podcast that brings you the latest insights and trends on the South Florida commercial real estate market, with your hosts, Fernando Arencibia Jr. and Jennifer Woolman. In each episode, we dive into the world of commercial real estate and break down complex concepts to make them accessible for everyone. Whether you're a real estate professional, a curious investor, or just interested in the South Florida market in general, Between Two Chairs is the podcast for you. So pull up a chair and join us.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Between Two Chairs. My name is Fernando Arencibia Jr. With me is the very studious Jennifer Woolman. Hi, Jennifer. Say hi.
Hi, everybody. I'm laughing because
you never know what's coming?
Yes. I don't know what's coming. I have no idea what's going to come out of my mouth.
You know what's even better?
What?
I don't know what's coming myself.
So you were asking me what we should name this episode because it's kind of one that I invented during our last episode based on ICSE.
I love it.
So I thought we should call it Retail Ratatouille.
Oh my God. Okay.
And so for those of you who don't know.
Because of the dish or because of the movie is what I want to know.
I know. That's what I thought. No rats in this retail. So it's not about the movie about the rat who wants to become a chef. But Ratatouille is a French dish that is a mix of like everything that's left over from the summer garden, right? So I figured this is a mix of everything that's left over in my brain from my CSC.
All right, guys, I'm warning you because I care for our audience. You know, you're about to delve into the mind of Jennifer Woolman. It is a very dangerous place to live. So that's why she has to go running every morning just to calm her brain down.
It's true. I have to rein that puppy in somehow.
But you mentioned that you wanted to have a conversation about some of the retail insights that you gathered in our last conference at ICSE and at Florida Realtors.
Correct. I left everybody with the cliffhanger of the last speaker that I wanted to mention, who was one of my favorites just because he was talking about something that I love, and he's extremely insightful, and he told a great story about his mom and a bathing suit that I'm not going to repeat here, but that was John Crossman, the founder and president of CrossMarc Services. They're a commercial firm in Central Florida. I believe they're out of Winter Haven or somewhere around there. Super, super nice guy. I saw him at ICSE. He did one of the live videos that I said, I hope they recorded those live videos so that the people who didn't see it live can see it recorded. And then he spoke at our Commercial Alliance meeting and provided a lot of great insights. And one of the things that he spoke about was the 2-10 rule for retail. And that basically is that most grocers and retailers, I think in general, want to be within a 2-mile radius of 10,000 people. So he said, so if you take that number and you take the number that is often quoted of 1,000 people a day moving into Florida, that means we need a grocery store to open just about every 10 days in the state. So it talks about the popularity of, grocers in Florida as a state where they want to be, which we've seen recently. We've seen more of the smaller, like the Trader Joe's and the Aldi's opening up and people consolidating, etc. So I thought that was super interesting. And then he highlighted that tourists spend 5 times more than locals. So for grocers who, which are very low margin business, the difference between a tourist and a local. So tourists come, let's say we were in Orlando, right? So use Disney. They're staying at Disney. They're in an extended stay hotel or an Airbnb. They're going to go out and buy some staples for the time that they're there. So they have some snacks for the kids, some breakfast stuff maybe, and etc. So he said, so imagine if you're a grocer in a tourist area, you're going to sell 52 bottles of ketchup a year versus 4. If it's just a resident who likes ketchup, if you're me, I'll buy ketchup maybe once a decade when it expires. Like, I'm not a big ketchup user, but
so condiments, salt, all those things that really are not everyday purchases.
Correct.
Become more of a repeat. Makes sense. Yeah.
And then he also said, I'm going to throw out everything you said, and then there's one that I really want to get into a discussion on. The other one was that retail is more susceptible to politics because it's not a lead, it's not a leading source. It follows cities, but cities try to push things through, ignoring who they are, and they just think about what they want to bring based on who they aspire to be. And that's when a lot of times retail doesn't work. And that reminds me of a deal that I'm working on in an area where they're like, oh, we want, and they mentioned a ton of retailers coming in and how they wanted to develop it to be similar to other areas in the United States. One of them was a little town that I'd never been to, so I did an Esri report on the little town versus the town that I'm working in and trying to sell something in. And I said, you guys have a total disconnect on who you really are and who you want to be. And I said, here's the difference. Who you want to be is a town where the average household income is $170,000 a year. Right. Your average household income is $50,000. You're not going to get those people to come here, those retailers who need the higher income earning demographic. So let's try to work within who you want to be with where you are now and take smaller steps and who can we bring in. So to me, that really resonated because you can see areas where the retail just doesn't work or people don't succeed. And usually it's because there's that disconnect with who's there and what they want to be. So, and then he also talked about how malls, when they were first developed, were supposed to be kind of the town center in a suburban area, right, that spread out. There was no real town center, so they were supposed to be the town centers where people went and hung out and did their shopping and everything. But, and this is the quote, they became too consistent and soulless and everything was exactly the same. And that killed it because there was nothing independent about it. And you and I have had conversations before about things that we're seeing in our market, right? Which to me scares me a little bit because so many cities have sections or they themselves become outdated because they're kind of like, what is that saying? They're something of their own success, right? They fail because they get so successful that they
become
lose
a victim of their own success.
Thank you. That's it.
Yeah, correct.
They become a victim of their own success. And a prime example locally for me is Lincoln Road in Miami Beach, right? It used to be a place where local and tourists would go. They had the funky art galleries. They had these great independent restaurants and outdoor cafes. They closed the street to traffic. They had done so many things right. And then because they were so successful, they sold, and the people that came in were more institutional, and they brought in the institutional type retailers.
Right.
And there was nothing great about Lincoln Road anymore other than you can walk down a closed street and,
Yeah, it loses its flavor. It loses its essence. And because I remember, I'm sure they still have it, but it was really a great experience to do the farmer's market on Lincoln Road. I think it was every Sunday morning. And it was, just a very different vibe and a very different experience.
And to your point, I think that's why farmers markets are becoming so popular again, right? So that got me thinking, the last thing that I wrote, because for me that was like the mic drop moment, was that retail needs to return to the 80s, not to 1980s, but the 1880s.
Okay.
When they were individual stores where people knew your name, where it was locals shopping locally, helping the local, the owners, the neighbor, the customers, the neighbor, Right. And I thought about that because several things came up during ICSC that got my brain, I would have had to run a half marathon to straighten these ideas.
Back up, because that's an interesting sentence. But why does he feel that he needs to return to the 1880s, where you would have the single store, where you have the relationship with the...
Because he feels like we're getting too soulless again, that everything's becoming the same. And think about it. If everything becomes the same, and every time I step outside my door, I'm eating the same thing, regardless of where I am. I could be in Miami, I could be in Coral Springs. If everything is the same, why go out? Why shop? I can sit in my chair in the comforts of my home, eat my own cooking, which I happen to like to cook. Right. I don't know how good I am. My kids would argue whether they would eat my cooking.
I don't know, man. I've never tasted your cooking. The only thing I've ever tasted is
Corinna's banana.
Hey, Corinna, come on, it's been too long. A little banana cake, a little banana action. Come on.
So anyway, I think that was his point, is that, remember, like the general store, yes, it was kind of like a smaller version of Costco and Walmart and all these others that have a little bit of everything, but it was more personable. So the reason...
I think there's so many things that come to my mind. Like, I was thinking about the 210 rule as well. And I was thinking, well, has Instacart, for example, affected that 210 rule? Our retail is gonna look at it just like we shifted our mindset about when we were looking at distance. It used to be that people would only look at, when they were looking at driving patterns and traffic, they were looking at distance. And then that shifted where they were taking, we got to look at driving time.
Right.
The distance really doesn't matter. If the flow of traffic is really good and I could get there in 5 minutes, then it's really driving time that becomes a more important metric to evaluate. And I'm wondering if the Instacarts of the world are going to really shift that mindset of, okay, maybe I don't have to be within 2 miles of 10,000 people in order for me to find that success. And to your point, it really shifts the dynamic, because what I see is, I'm sure that there are certain automatic staples that everybody always gets, right? I'm wondering if there is a place to have, the big grocery store, but then to have a smaller space that only has those staples,
right? But
that it's easier to reach a bigger group of people. And so you don't have to have a huge footprint, but now you're satisfying, let's say, 80 or 90% of all the orders that come in through Instacart. So, I wonder if there is a little bit of an evolution. I don't know. I wasn't at the meeting, but was there any discussion or question about that?
No, we didn't. We were talking more about the in-person experience of retail. But I think, to your point, like, what comes first, right? Would I go buy those staples because the thought of going out to a big old store that's far away, I
gotta find parking.
Right, I gotta find parking. Exactly. Or would it be something that if I can run in and know what I need real quick and pick it up and grab it, and I might pass 3 to 5 supermarkets. And I'm thinking about that because on the way home, we went to a little town called Sebastian, which is on the Treasure Coast. Yeah. Adorable little town, but we were looking at it and you can tell that it's in the path of progress, right? It's not quite there yet. They don't really have a formal downtown. So it was really cool because we were driving around. I'm like, okay, so where would you put the downtown? We were talking about where would you put the downtown and what makes sense and what are the positives that how could you build this area given what it has. So we had all these really cool discussions. And then there were 2 grocery stores, one on the north end and one all the way on the south end. And either one from where you were was kind of a drive. And then so that was on the main US 1 drag. And then there were 2 other, there was a Winn-Dixie and a Publix. The Winn-Dixie was closed on the main drag coming off of 95 in, which kind of dealt with more of the suburbs that were closer to 95 or west of 95. Yeah. So super interesting because we were seeing all this kind of play out in an area, super, super concentrated density of Orlando versus an area that is coming, and how could that develop? And they might get it right and they might get it horribly wrong, right? Depending on who they aspire to be.
Yeah, I just find that interesting because that comment, it really is baffling me, that comment about retail needs to return to 1880s, because in the grocery business, they say that the most expensive real estate anywhere in the world. And the most competitive real estate to find is shelf space in a grocery store, right? And new brands have a very difficult time to be able to scale and make it to a grocery store. And, and I think to a degree, that's one of the losers in the early stages of Instacart. Let's say that we're still in the early stages of that experience, because people usually just get what they usually get, and even they make it easy, because the first thing you get is, okay, this is what you've ordered before. Do you want to look at the list? But any new products, any new brands have to fight for that. And I'm wondering if, do they have, is there a path where they have more success fighting for that online retail, real estate, rather than, at the store? You don't get those impulse buys, you don't get that experience of going in and identifying a new product, something cool, something like, oh, I've never tried this before, let me try it out. Right. As I'm thinking, and I'm sorry that I'm thinking out loud, but as I'm thinking about retail needs to return to 1880s, to that personable single store, I've often wondered is, if I'm an Instacarter, and I'm sorry, I mentioned Instacart, but let's say just a gig economy, kind of delivery.
Home delivery grocery business. Right.
There are some people that have delivered to my house that are just amazing, and I'm like, man, I wish that person would always deliver, because they pick the best fruit. They're very careful in the packing. They make sure it's really cool and all that stuff. And I wonder if there is a path, and I'm sure that a lot of these apps are not looking to create that. But imagine if you could request the same person,
right?
Or if the person is available, you're like, yeah, let me request this person, because I really, and have that relationship of, oh, I know you like it like this, so I got this, anyway.
That's super interesting, because I've never used used a home delivery other than Amazon. Yeah. Like, I've never done grocery shopping. I've never had food delivered. Right. Like, the thought just, I don't know. I just can't wrap my head around.
Yeah.
So,
but you never drove an electric car until you recently
right,
did.
I can't say never.
You never used automated driving until you did.
My daughter-in-law all the time. My daughter, when she lived in New York, I think did a lot more of it. My cousin who lived in New York, that's all they did was home delivery of everything, because there's no way to get a truck to park or anything. Yeah. So everything that they did was online. My son in Europe, also a lot of online. A lot of online stuff. And my daughter-in-law here, grocery shops online, like, oh my gosh, I don't have fruit for the week or whatever. So
I find it really interesting that, for example, and I saw this in our conference recently, but I've seen it in a lot of places where people fly to, and I saw it in Chicago. They flew to Chicago for a conference. They're in the hotel. And the first thing they think is they did an Instacart for staples that they wanted to have, snacks that they wanted to have in the room. They were going to be there for a week. And they went downstairs, they picked up, and they had grocery bags coming up. And
so I think his reasoning for that, and I think they're not two separate things. I think the reason he says that is, if you want to compete and you want to be relevant, then you're going to want to be a retail store that is personable, that offers an experience. And several of the online gurus, like Gary Vaynerchuk and the owner of the Mavericks, Mark Cuban, thank you. See, my brain only works part of the time. Former owner. I'll always remember him by that, though. So Mark Cuban said that as we become more and more online and there's more and more AI, that we're going to want more in-depth experiences. And yes, Gary says that the way to go forward with businesses is all Instagram shopping, that everything's going to be influential, spur of the moment shopping on Instagram. Right. But if you don't want that and you want the personal experience, then I think that's where you need to get back to the 1880s and the personable and the experience. You don't want to just go in to a super big store. And that got me thinking.
Well, it's really interesting that you mentioned that, because to me, TikTok has become QVC. Yeah. And when you go to TikTok and you look around, there's a bunch of people that are basically just showcasing a product. Oh, this is how I use it. And then they have the link so you could order. And listen, some are better than others. Some are more authentic than others. Some is just outright. It's
Crazy.
become a joke. But if you really think about it, it's like QVC on steroids, because every 30 seconds you can see an ad, or somebody that you're thinking you're watching a video, but you're really watching an ad for someone. And even now I saw that there are a bunch of pages of people that are trying out TikTok products, and they have created basically a page that says trying out TikTok products so that you don't have to, and then they'll go like, oh, this is great, or this is terrible, or whatever it is. It's really an interesting dynamic.
So, and the reason that all of this kind of resonated with me is because I spoke when I was at ICSC, a landlord that's in my neighborhood who I know pretty well was there, and he owns several of the smaller strip malls. Yeah. Well, not so small, but they're not grocery anchored. And I asked him, I said, so what are you seeing? What are you seeing in your centers? What are you seeing out there? And he said, I'm seeing that mom and pops are having a really hard time, like the small businesses. And granted, every mom and pop, some small businesses are really big. They're not necessarily mom and pop. But he said those small businesses and mom and pops are having a much harder time getting loans. So they might get tentatively approved for an SBA loan to start their business or expand their business, but then something happens and it's not coming through and the financing is hard to get. And then he told me that after I asked him that question, he went and spoke to one of the big, international brokers that he knew and asked him what he was seeing. And he said, look, there's a flight towards tenant quality in the national tenants that most of, and again, these are more institutional.
And the national landlords?
The national landlords, okay. and landlords that are grocery anchored, they might not even be national, but they own grocery anchored or larger centers.
And how are they defining quality tenants?
National tenants.
They just want credit.
They just want credit. And he said
tenants.
Not 100%, but way more than they used to. Yeah. They used to have more of a mix. So he says we haven't totally discarded the mom and pops. But that again tells me be careful. And their whole reasoning was to set it up for a sale.
But I thought that they had, well, that's interesting. It's true because they're looking at an exit strategy.
Correct.
So that makes more sense. I mean, I remember during the pandemic, that was kind of the lesson that they learned, that they had all these national retailers that were very tough on keeping up with their responsibilities. Some famously so on the news for keeping up their responsibility to the landlord. And there was also the conversation, and I remember we had Beth and Hugh speak on this, and it was the conversation about if you have a CMBS loan, for example, on your shopping center, that was a very difficult conversation to have. You couldn't even call to say, hey, are there any options? Because then you would be put on a blacklist, basically, and they would be concerned that this might become a distressed asset, whereby if you had a local, regional, commercial bank, a community bank that was lending on your shopping center, you could have those conversations, those honest conversations, and not to the detriment of the future investment of the shopping centers.
Well, and I think it depends also on the size, right? And who your audience is, because to your point, these big nationals exit strategy, but a lot of the people that we work with wouldn't buy one of those centers. No. They want centers that are on short-term leases, that are value add, that have more flexibility, and maybe they have one or two national tenants or some national franchises.
Yeah, well, what you're referring to is people that are, we want national tenants, long-term leases, because we want to sell it, and they're going to sell it to an institutional investor. They're not going to sell it to, necessarily the kind of investors that we're talking about that are trying to add value. But what I find really interesting is we've seen it time and again where there are some malls and shopping centers that just get devalued by the lack of curation of the experience. To your point, everything is the same. I don't have mom and pops. I don't have any unique experiences. And as a result of that, then they fall into disarray. And then they have to invest so much into relifting the value of that shopping center. They have to invest in the physical transformation of the shopping center, and then they have to go out there and attract the tenants. I mean, it kind of becomes a situation where you're sort of creating your demise without thinking about it, because you're not being intentional about the curation. Like, when I think of people like Beth and Hugh, they always talk about how important it is to be intentional about the unit, the tenant mix in your centers.
Correct.
Yeah.
So, and I think there were 2 articles that were written on LinkedIn recently, both by people that we've mentioned before. Yeah. One was by Mark Toro, who is developing huge mixed use communities outside of Atlanta. Right. And he was talking about how, a lot of mixed-use projects, he says, they get the hardware right, but they don't get the vibe right, and they fail. Yeah. And so he was talking about the software, which included the pedestrian flow, the plaza experience, the hospitality level of service. Yeah. Like, to our point, the whole overall experience. So I'm thinking of these strip centers that the one big, national broker was saying they're leading to, versus these guys who are developing from the ground up and what they're experiencing. And I don't know, I'm leaning towards the Mark Toros and Paco Underhill. Paco also...
Paco Underhill, who wrote Why We Shop. Right. Right, and he basically is... an expert in the psychology of retail and shopping and all those things.
Exactly.
And I find these conversations so interesting because I think they are very insightful to human behavior. And if you're in the service industry, if you're in the sales industry, I think the insights that you get when you look into the psychology of retail are really important for 2 reasons. Number one, you learn a lot about yourself and your own behavior, and number 2, you learn about the behavior of the people that you're serving, of your clients or your future clients. So I find that really
and I think that's
impactful.
Where we in the real estate industry have to be very thoughtful and intentional in everything that we do, because it's very easy to follow a trend or to be chasing. We always have shiny objects that we can chase, and I think having kind of this more insightful look. Yeah. He's giving me an insightful look. An insightful look is important. So what Paco wrote recently in a LinkedIn post that he did was, when he first started, he went to Minneapolis and he met with Jim Bowser, who was the VP of store planning at Target, and they were talking, and they went downstairs in the building and they looked at all of the retail that was at the base of the building. And he said, one concept Jim Bowser planted with me was the need of retail minds to step daily beyond their immediate frame of reference. So what happened is, he says, a lot of these retailers were in big cities and then left, and they went to the suburbs, and he quotes all of the ones that have failed, where they got outside of their home base and they lost touch with the people that had founded them. So I thought that was super interesting how, and this was the head of Target, and this was back in the early 80s. Wow. So anyway, that was my kind of brainstorm, and I'd love to hear people's thoughts on it, because I get it. I get the institutional quality, but when I think of that, I also think of sterile and no interest and kind of everything being the same, and that's one of the things. I mean, if you travel to Europe or you travel to small towns around the United States that have gotten it right, it's because they've kept true, while they've changed and innovative, they've kept true to who they are with the mix of people across the board, not just retail, but office and resident and everything that they attract to their area. And I don't know, I think to me, diversity is way more exciting than...
I just think that there has to be a balance, because the convenience factor is not going to go away, and the flight to that is not going to go away, especially with the fast-paced life that we live, especially in big cities, right? And so I completely understand the point, and I think it is a good, and true point. But what I'm suggesting is that we have to marry the authenticity of that experience that we're searching for, while still providing the functionality and the convenience that people are expecting.
That's why so many places are allowing return, like Whole Foods takes Amazon returns, right? And other places are shrinking their footprint. They don't need to be as big. I mean, they've seen the success of both Aldi and Trader Joe's, are a much smaller footprint than a regular supermarket. And they don't have all of the options and all of the choices, but for quick in and outs, they're super convenient. Alrighty.
Well,
that's all, folks.
Well, I thought it was worth the wait, just because it really fosters a lot of conversation. And these are the kind of things that, for people that are not part of the real estate industry, or for example, if you're in commercial real estate, but you don't deal with food and beverage, the food and beverage industry, for example, these are the kind of conversations and thoughts that, or retail and shopping centers and things like that. But these are the kind of conversations that, very good commercial real estate brokers dive into, understanding what percentage of revenue, for example, a restaurant should be the max that they pay in rent, understanding the dynamics of how the metrics work, what are the margins, all those things. So when you dive into the world of commercial real estate, and let's say you specialize in food and beverage, you begin to think like the operator of the restaurant, because, that gives you an advantage of understanding whether a release structure in one place might work, but it might not be on the other. And aside from the considerations of the financials, there's considerations like what you mentioned. How close am I to the people that I'm serving? I've had food and beverage operators that are only looking for how many daytime workers there are, right? Because they're only focused on breakfast and lunch. And so they're looking at that 9 to 5 crowd. They're not really thinking about what happens after a certain hour, because they're looking in a location where it is largely that, right? Where people don't necessarily go out to dinner as often as in other places, but you have an influx of people that are driving to these places because there's large centers of employment. And now, they're looking at that 9 to 5 crowd. So, this is why we love commercial real estate, because it's so diverse. There's so much specificity. There's so much speciality when it comes to when you're looking at a class or an asset class and a niche within that asset class, that, it just becomes, infinitely interesting. So for those of you who love it as much as we do and that are listening to our podcast, we really, really appreciate your support. And we would love to hear from you about any topics that you want us to cover. We are here for all of it. So for the amazing Jennifer Woolman and myself, we thank you. Jennifer, say bye.
Bye.
Bye. Karina, get that
banana bread.
Get that vegan banana bread ready.
I'm ripening bananas as we speak.
That's right. There you go.